In this short screencast, I'll present a few of the thinking tools that I've used quite a bit and found to be useful in terms of structuring, guiding the thinking process. Now, there's two in one here, and these are pretty famous ones. One is mind mapping, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Basic idea of mind mapping is that it mirrors the natural architecture of the brain. So what it enables is the capturing of lots of information under key headings, and then from each of those headings to have subordinate or data that is contained within those headings. So what it basically means is that we can build up a big connected picture of an aspect of reality that we're talking about. So we could have a mind map on, for example, in this case, Edward de Bono's thinking hats. And essentially, that's another thinking tool. So let's have a little look at what that means. What Edward de Bono has pointed out, and there's many things he pointed out, is that in meetings when lots of people are talking, the information is kind of flying around in random ways and it doesn't get captured and important things get lost. And what the thinking hats tool does, it imposes a structure on the thinking process. And it works as a metaphor. For example, if we're discussing something, it could be, do we have more foreign talent coming to Singapore? And if the facilitator says, right, we put on our white hat, people can only speak when they're presenting facts, not opinions. So it stops people arguing over different things. What are the facts about immigrants coming to Singapore? Now, when the red hat goes on, then people can say, oh, well, I think it's a great thing because it brings in new blood and new ideas and whatever. And equally, people can say, oh, yeah, but we're too crowded already. We don't want any more people here. And as you can see, each hat has a particular focus. So when the green hat comes on, for example, people can only come up with some new idea. They can't speak, and they're not supposed to speak anyway, unless they're coming up with some new idea. So the idea is to bring a bit of creative thinking into the discourse. And the other one I'll highlight is the blue hat, because metacognition we mentioned quite a lot. When the blue hat goes on, then people have got to look at all the information that's generated, the big picture, and try to say, well, okay, what's emerging here? What are perhaps the big issues, or what are some big questions? So that's a two-in-one for you. Two thinking tools, and you can see how they're pretty good at organising the thinking process. But if people are talking nonsense, it's not going to make an hell of a lot of difference. Okay, a very simple analytical tool, but it helps us to look at something and say, well, okay, what's the pluses, what's the minuses? And sometimes we're not sure, so we'll stick that under interesting, and then we'll continue to look at it and have discourse about it and think about it. Very simple, easy to use, but an effective tool. Okay, here's a more complex one, and this is if you're trying to bring about some kind of significant change, and there's a lot of information, a lot of ideas to deal with. And the basic idea is to identify on the left-hand side, what are the forces driving change? So if we're talking about changing education in some way, there might be some specific forces like cost cutting or the need to make learning more real world focused. But equally, there might be forces resisting change, which is existing perceptions about teaching or lecturers not wanting to change, etc., etc. And the basic idea is to look at these different forces, both changing and resisting the change. And then looking at ways in which you can perhaps use some of the forces for driving the change as ways to push over the resisting forces, and also to look at the resisting forces and see if you can turn some of them against each other if possible. So it's an idea of dealing with complex pictures in order to come up with some high leverage change strategies. Now, moving more into creative thinking, or trying to encourage creative thinking, what Edward de Bono again points out, and the evidence is strongly supportive of this, is that the brain is largely an information processing system. It's not naturally creative. And when we experience new things, we typically put it through existing neural pathways, and we'll tend to see it in ways consistent with our previous learning and beliefs. So what he's saying is you've got to break up these existing neural networks, and you've got a couple of good techniques. One is forced associations, and that is that you take something, like you've got a problem that the lifts are perceived as slow, and you force associate it with something that you would not normally do. For example, a mirror. And in this situation, and this is a real case where the problem of slow lifts was solved by the use of putting some mirrors by the lifts. The lifts didn't go any quicker, but people would get to the lift and would look in the mirror, and that would kill a bit of time, and it didn't seem so long. So that's forced associations. Similar kind of technique to break up things is to make provocative operations or suggestions. Like, let's say, well, everybody should go to prison. Well, it might seem a silly idea on the surface, but maybe if everybody did go to prison, less people would eventually go to prison who do go to prison, because if everybody knew that prison was pretty harsh, it might deter some people. Well, let's abolish schools. Again, it might seem silly, but hold on a minute. There's a lot of schools being abolished, and there's a lot of people having different educational arrangements. So the idea is to put in a provocative statement that just changes or tries to encourage some reframing of the situation. So there's a few examples of thinking tools. I hope it illustrates the basic idea that they don't do good thinking, but they encourage a particular type of organisation to the thinking process.